I'm Allan Reich. I chair the AJC's National Policy Commission, and I serve on AJC's Executive Council. And I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to this very special AJC University session. Of all the changes that have occurred in the field of intergroup relations in the United States over the last 60 years, the marked diminution in what used to be called the Black-Jewish Alliance or Coalition is one of the more perplexing. That alliance can be recalled today in the form of iconic images, one of the most famous of which being the photo of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel walking arm in arm with Martin Luther King in 1965 in Selma. Here at AJC, we have our own visual memories, pictures of Reverend King speaking and receiving an award at AJC's 1965 annual meeting. And the annual meeting was the predecessor of the Global Forum. To be sure, that relationship remains in place in a substantial number of settings, whether it's at the local level, as reflected by the Black-Jewish Coalition in Atlanta, or bilateral and multilateral relations at the national level with, for example, AJC and other Jewish organizations still being valued partners and very much at the table at the at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's premier civil rights coalition. But those continuing relationships are really outliers against a background of distancing in which too many members of our two communities remain strangers to one another. The current condition of Black-Jewish relations can best be described as being in the state of benign, and in some quarters not so benign, ambivalence. Our session this morning will focus on the complex factors that over the decades have frayed the fabric of Black-Jewish relationship and ponder the question of whether and how those bonds can be restored and strengthened for the benefit of both of our communities and for American society in general. To help us develop a perspective on the past, present, and future of Black-Jewish relations, we have with us today Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed, who is also, we're proud to say, a Project Interchange alumnus, Rabbi Shai Held. I'm missing one of my pages. Oh, no, here it is. Rabbi Shai Held. I was going to have to wing it, and I rewrote this. Rabbi Shai Held, the rabbinic dean and chair of Jewish thought at Mechon Hadar, a man often named as one of the most influential rabbis in the United States. And my dear friend, Dr. Lonnie Bunch III, founding director of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, and also a Project Interchange alumnus. And I must tell you that Lonnie and I share a special bond that goes back a decade. We were two stranded strangers in Indianapolis one stormy night trying to find a way to get back to Chicago. And we looked at each other and we said, "You don't look too strange. Would you like to rent a car together and drive back to Chicago?" And that began an evening at Discovery, where we discovered how much we share in common, and it's blossomed into a dear friendship. Our moderator this morning was supposed to be Abigail Pogrebin, but a last-minute emergency has unfortunately kept her in New York, and we're hoping that she's feeling better. It's not a life-threatening situation. We're delighted, however, that our own Richard Foltin, AJC Director of National and Legislative Affairs, will be leading today's conversation. We have an eminent and thoughtful panel and not a lot of time for this critical conversation. So I'll hand it over now to Richard. But I want to say that hopefully this is a first step and not a last step in really addressing this issue. Thank you very much.
Good morning, panel. Thank you for being here. Yes, it's true, I'm not Abby Pogrebin. And I want to stress that because this was not designed as a manel, which is to say a panel of only men. But it is how we wound up. In addition, there was another speaker who was going to be with us, Bakari Sellers, who's a CNN analyst, but unfortunately he couldn't be here either. But I think it means we have more time to hear the wisdom of the three panelists we've got here, and I think you'll all be delighted. I also want to note that the questions I've got is something Abby and I worked on together, so her input is very much part of this discussion. So let me just begin with a couple of notes that at least those of us of a certain age well know the lore of the deep Jewish connection to the civil rights movement that Allan has spoken about, not only the march in Selma, but also the young American Jews, Michael Schwimmer and Andrew Goodman, who were murdered with African-American James Chaney as they traveled to Mississippi to help voter registration in 1964. And more than the personal commitment of a few, including those who were beaten or gave their lives, the civil rights movement was very much a Jewish communal priority. When the Supreme Court issued its 1954 landmark Brown against Board of Education decision ending segregation in public schools, Chief Justice Warren cited AJC's study of segregation's effect on African American children. But important as those memories are, and perhaps they look gauzier in the rearview mirror, one could argue that the first rule of intergroup relations, as in politics, is, what have you done for me today? So in the short time we have, we're going to be looking just a bit into the past, both the good and the bad, but the focus then will be on where we are now in the relationship between these two great American communities, African Americans and Jewish Americans, and where are we going, and what can we do and what should we do to have an impact on the course of our future together. So I'm going to begin. I've a question for each of our panelists, which are focused.
My mic slipped.
Oh. Which are focused on each of these time frames, past, present, and future. I welcome the panelists. If you want to make some brief comments after hearing one of the other panelists, please jump in. And then there may be, if there's time, another round of questions. And certainly, very quickly, we're going to turn to you all, who I know have questions and comments, hopefully mostly questions, that you want to share with us. So let me first turn to Lonnie Bunch, if I might, the historian amongst us, to help us with the history beyond the civil rights movement, beyond the 1960s, looking into the decades that followed, the anti-poverty programs, the conflicts that arose. I'm from New York originally, so I'm thinking about the public school conflicts that took place in Crown Heights and elsewhere, Farrakhan moving apart in the 70s, the disappointment of the Jewish community in seeing anti-Semitism in minority communities linked to the welcome rise of black empowerment. Could you provide us with your observations on, how we got to where we are today and what the trend lines have been?
Sure. I thought you were going to take my whole talk, but
okay.
That's okay. One of the things that struck me as a historian thinking about this is how deep the relationship is. We often focus on the civil rights movement, crucially important, but the relationship goes much further than that. For many African Americans, those held in bondage, the notion of the struggle of Jews in Egypt in biblical time was crucially important. So much of African American cultural history has been shaped by, quoting, "Let my people go," by being shaped in profound ways by that experience. And so in some ways, even though the enslaved didn't realize what the connection was, there has always been this interest in the Jewish past. But in some ways, it's really came very strong in the late 19th and early 20th century. Because as you know, while German Jews came to the United States in the 1840s, 1850s, most Southern Eastern European Jews came in the 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century. At the same time, African Americans were moving from the South to urban centers for the first time in their experience. And what you found were two groups of people treated very much alike: segregated, ghettoized, discriminated against, and they found common ground. They found a sense that if we could find ways to eliminate discrimination from one, it eliminates discrimination from others. And I think that for me, while we always talk about the golden age being the civil rights movement, for me the golden age is the early 20th century. The creation of the NAACP, the Urban League, the kind of real collaboration when Jewish newspapers constantly attacked the racial violence, calling it pogroms, making sure that the Jewish community understood that it had a very visceral connection with the African American community. And for me, that period really built a foundation that led to, in many ways, what many people call the golden era, which is the civil rights movement. And I think the civil rights movement is just really amazingly special because it was a time, because of Black-Jewish relations, that people believed in an America that they couldn't see yet. People believed that they could confront evils that had been part of America since its very inception. And for me, what is so powerful about that relationship is, yes, people marched, people were killed, people were beat up, people sacrificed all. But what they also did was come together and show America what happens when people of goodwill come together and demand America live up to its stated ideals. So for me, what history suggests is, first of all, that despite where the relationship is, and we can talk about Crown Heights and Jesse Jackson, we can talk about disappointment in President Obama and his relationship with Israel. There's a lot of things we can talk about of the splintering of the relationship. But for me, that relationship was one of the moments when African Americans really believed that other people cared about them and were part of the struggle to change. So my hope is that looking back, that we can recapture that relationship, because without that, we're all in the wilderness. Thank you.
So turning from, a peek at the past to the present, we do keep hearing, as Allan in his introductory remarks reflected, this notion of a diminution of the Jewish-Black relationship. The question, I guess, is, are there real relationships still today? What do we make of the increasing tendency in some quarters to identify the struggle to get into a difficult issue right away, a struggle of Palestinians, to compare that somehow with the civil rights movement? And yet, as we also heard, there are ongoing relationships still, and the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition was selected as a marquee figure for that. So, Kasim Reed, could you talk to us a little bit about how you see the present in terms of Black Jewish relations, and what we can learn from the experience of that coalition and the important work that the leadership that Atlanta has shown in maintaining that relationship?
I'm happy to do it. First, thank you for having me. My thought is really clear. Be careful of throwing away old relationships that were vital to where you are today. You may need them again. And my sense of where we are right now is that just when you believe that you may not need a friend, things change. And the current environment right now, candidly, is an environment that I believe is fomenting very bad feelings towards Jewish people and Black people and many others. And many of the historic relationships, certainly the historic relationship between Black people and Jewish people, is going to be the template for how the country can get through the difficulties that it has with a rapidly diversifying population. And so I think that this relationship is vital, which is why I'm sitting right here right now, because I believe that it's no different from a garden that hasn't been tended. I don't care who you are. If you have a garden and you don't pay attention to it and work at it, give some time to it, it's just, you're going to have weeds where flowers should grow. And so I think that people like me and folks like you and others at important thought leadership conferences like today and in other places around the world need to, one, reassert the importance of it, two, understand that it changes, three, understand that the relationships that were authentic have aged out. So in my city, Rabbi Rothschild's relationship with Dr. Martin Luther King was fundamental to where the city of Atlanta is today. Started out with Rabbi Rothschild believing that Dr. Martin Luther King should have a dinner celebrating his Nobel Peace Prize, and nobody was coming to the dinner. And then the CEO of Coca-Cola heard about it, and he got in a room at the Capital City Club in Atlanta and said, I'm having a dinner, and if you want to continue to do business with Coca-Cola, I look forward to seeing you. But what did it do? It really did create a template. It was the first integrated dinner in the city of Atlanta. And so if you say, how in the world did this sleepy southern town win the Centennial Olympic Games? how in the world did this sleepy southern town now sit as the center of the 9th biggest metropolitan area in the country? It's because New York capital and global capital wanted to invest in the South because the population was moving there, and they looked at Birmingham, Alabama, which had a bigger economy in 1958, 59, and 60, and they had Bull Connor and George Wallace, and they looked at Atlanta, Georgia, with a mayor named Ivan Allen who testified in favor of the civil rights movement, rabbis like Rothschild and Sugarman, men like Jimmy Carter, governors like Carl Sanders, and they said capital is going here. And so as we sit here today, with no disrespect to good people in Birmingham, the economy of the metropolitan Atlanta region is 3 times that of Birmingham. But we've got to work at these relationships. And so that's why folks in my generation have to speak up. Last year, almost at this very time, I had 15,000 protesters in downtown Atlanta who were protesting a shooting in Minnesota and Baton Rouge. And then after that, I had a group of young folks from Black Lives Matter protest me for having a coordinated 18-year relationship with the Israeli Defense Ministry. And they submitted a list of demands demanding that I cease cooperating with Israel. And I told them it will be a brief meeting because my answer to that is no. So, all of that's just my way of saying is that this relationship is worth it. But the people that lived it, the people that marched with Dr. Martin Luther King, are simply getting more mature. And folks like me, my dad was involved in the civil rights movement in South Carolina. My father told me that when he looked to his left and to his right, if they weren't black, they were probably Jewish, people that he was side by side with. But I didn't live that. And you all know things that are lived are more impactful than things that are told. And so we have an obligation to continue to live it. I went through the Black Jewish Coalition. I went through Project Interchange. I have been to Israel. I have seen what people in Israel go through. So my concept is different. I just don't view the Jewish community as a group of rich folks, which if we were having a real conversation, many black people sit around wondering, what in the world are Jewish people talking about? Right? Because if you haven't been to Israel, you don't have the knowledge of what people in Israel have actually been through to be where they are in America. So I'm sorry for going on so long, but I'm so passionate about this relationship. But if you're passionate about something, you got to stand up for it. You got to speak up for it. You got to let folks know that it's important to you. And when folks call on you to be somewhere and stand up, you got to do it. That's how the relationship lives and thrives.
So your comment about the previous leadership aging out, I think, turns us to the future of the relationship. And so, as I turn to Shai Held, thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, what does it portend? How should we understand that? Is there a difference between people, first of all, concerned about the social justice issue of racial disparities in law enforcement versus some of the really startling things that were in that platform document, but also, more broadly, Shai, could you address the issue of where, from your perspective, the Jewish community and the black community need to be going so they can come together, if that's possible, and how is that relationship playing out, given the controversies that began last summer with that Black Lives Matter platform, which caused so much alarm in parts of the Jewish community?
Yeah, well,
You got
thank
the
you
easy
for having
question.
me. Yeah, I get the lighthearted question. Great. Let me start by saying this about the Black Jewish Coalition. I recently read something, an old essay of Cornel West's, in which he says, African Americans tend to play down Black Jewish cooperation in the civil rights movement, and Jews tend to romanticize it. And since I'm speaking in a room of Jewish leaders as a Jewish leader, I want to focus on that second part. It seems to me that it is far easier to romanticize civil rights leaders of the past than it is to embrace and perhaps even be a civil rights leader of the present. And I think far too many Jews in Jewish establishment organizations are comfortable looking at a picture of Abraham Joshua Heschel and saying, isn't it wonderful that he did that? While at the same time being a little hesitant about asking, what would he do now? I think that actually just needs to be said front and center. The same thing is true, by the way, about the American domestication of Martin Luther King, right? The Martin Luther King that most Americans celebrate is basically like a feel-good, hallmarked version of a man who was in many ways a radical, a man who talked about consumerism, who talked about militarism, who talked about all kinds of fundamental questions about America that we basically never acknowledged that he raised. So I'm incredibly grateful that we have gotten to the point in America that we honor Dr. King with an annual day. But I think we often honor people by kind of reining in their legacy rather than letting them talk. And I think that's true about Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement, and it's true about the African American leaders with the civil rights movement too. So I want to suggest that the first sort of prerequisite for a relationship moving forward, if it's about pursuing justice in America, is about not just celebrating the past, but looking at the future. And then to make the second point, in order to do that, one has to be willing to look at the present honestly. James Baldwin, used to say over and over again that his great frustration with white people in America is essentially that they can't even begin to imagine the extent to which they've never lived in the country many African Americans live in. I say to Jewish audiences all the time, which are dominated by white people, right? I say to Jewish audiences all the time, really imagine what it would be like for you if you had the hedge fund you have, or if you taught in the public school that you taught in, or if you were the doctor that you were, and you had to figure out how old your kid had to be before you told them to be careful if they were ever pulled over for something totally minor because they could wind up dead. How would your perspective on the world change if you truly tried to stand in the shoes of the conversation? You have no idea what that is. I have no idea what that is. And so I think the second piece is actually about listening, about really listening to the fact that Jewish experience and black experience in America are not the same. Julius Lester, shortly after he converted to Judaism, said in one of his essays something that really struck me. He said, American Jews are very invested. We're talking now in the 80s, he writes this. American Jews are very invested in the idea that black American experience and Jewish American experience are parallel. The only problem is that that's completely false. And in fact, what we really have is that European Jewish experience and black American experience have parallels, but since American Jews feel so connected to European Jewish experience, they imagine that it's the American Jewish experience. And he says, nothing is more offensive to African Americans than being told by a fairly successful group of people who have been accepted as white. That in itself is its own history. That was not always true. But to be told by people who have been accepted as white that, I totally know how you feel. I mean, Baldwin says this in his famous essays, right? The Negro is anti-Semitic because he's anti-white, right? He says, no, frankly, you have no idea. You actually have no idea. Let's have a relationship that starts by your acknowledging that. And I'll say, as someone who spends a lot of time teaching young adults, that's most of what I do, that's a real gap in the Jewish community, a generation gap. I find that the students I teach who are under 40 are much more open to this than the students I teach who are over 40. Students who are under 40 are much more open to the extent to which they don't understand and they need to listen. Now, listening, and I'll just say one more sentence if I could, listening is a two-way street, right? And so I think it is important to make clear, believing that all struggles for civil rights and human rights are interwoven is a perfectly legitimate and in some ways an important thing to believe. But conflating things too facilely that are very different is actually unhelpful for everyone involved, right? So, to spend all of your time, that's not a fair formulation, but to spend so much time demonizing Israel and let's not talk about the intersectionality, about the status of women in, say, Saudi Arabia or Iran, just strikes me as a very odd thing to say. So, I personally experienced this from both sides in the past year when, having been involved in protests of police brutality in New York after the killing of Eric Garner, when I responded to the Movement for Black Lives platform by saying that talking about the occupation as a moral evil is perfectly legitimate and I would say even important. Talking about it as a genocide is a blood libel. Right? So then all of a sudden, instead of being hammered from the right, I was hammered from the left, right? That how can you talk this way? Well, here's the point. I think dialogue requires self-respect. And just as, I would expect the heirs of James Baldwin to say to me, shut up and listen. I want them to say that to me when it's appropriate. I also think it's important for Jews who take the relationship seriously to be able to say, not just to say, as I hear far too many Jews say, well, the failure was that we weren't at the table when the platform was drafted. By the way, that's true. But you shouldn't need to have Jews at the table in order to realize that the occupation is not a genocide. That is a kind of rolling over that I am not in favor of. I don't think relationships, this is true about any relationship you've ever been in on a one-on-one relationship. If you roll over, right, you're not in a genuine relationship. So honesty goes both ways, and we need to be willing to talk about those things. My hope, for whatever it's worth, is that the legacy of the excruciating and unbearable and frankly unconscionable moment that we are in this country is that we are now seeing a reemergence of a certain kind of political activism, and I hope that one of the things we will see is a willingness to have a very much needed conversation about how America can finally reckon with its original sin of racism.
If I might just ask a follow-up question, and here I say lahavdil because I don't want to compare what some Jews right now are experiencing to anything resembling the struggle that African Americans have faced. But you have a situation where, especially among young Jews who want to be part of a social justice project, in effect being told they have to disown an integral part of their identity by becoming rabidly, not just critical of Israel, but rabidly anti-Israel. They have to reject, in some quarters, even the very notion of the legitimacy of the State of Israel. Otherwise, they're not welcome at the table. What do we do to respond to that and to ensure, as a matter of self-respect, that we as Jews are not expected to give up an essential part of identity to be part of the larger beloved community?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a really hard question. I'll say what I said yesterday when I had the privilege of speaking to college students who are here. It should not be complicated to be able to say, if you're in a progressive political context, the following two sentences. Number one, the occupation has taken an enormous moral toll on Israel and has inflicted untold damage on Palestinian lives, and there has to be a way to bring it to an end. And an obsessive, even monomaniacal focus on Israel's crimes, as opposed to the crimes of any other country in the world, is foolish at best and frankly anti-Semitic at worst. The problem is that all too often you have people on the left who can only say number one, and people on the right who can only say number two, and neither one of those moves is all that helpful, right? I always say, if you cannot say the word occupation, you will make no contribution whatsoever to struggling against BDS, right? You can spend all the philanthropic dollars in the world. If you're not willing to talk about occupation, nothing you do about BDS will be interesting to anyone who's actually drawn to it. You have to be willing to talk about why an issue is complicated and why you reject simplistic notions on the right and the left. Now, if that means that certain organizations or groups of people exclude you, then you know what? There have been many. The civil rights movement was run by many organizations that didn't always agree with each other, right? Not everyone in CORE agreed with everyone in SNCC, and not all black leaders. See, Jews should not allow themselves to say, well, all black leaders are supporters of BDS, and that, right? That's just not true. And I think we have to work harder than that to figure out where coalitions are possible. Who are the people who support BDS who are open to a conversation? Who are the people who support BDS who you can't talk to? So don't talk to them. But they are not the extent of civil rights activism in America. And so we also be careful also, while standing up for ourselves, not to give ourselves a pass by saying, oh, well, you know, Black Lives Matter, that's a racist movement. That's just honestly too facile, right? So who can I talk to? And I have to do the work of figuring out who that is and who can I work with.
Thank you. I have lots more questions, but this is not only about my questions. Let's turn to the audience, and this gentleman in the back.
Thank you, sir.
And there'll be a microphone coming to you. Please tell us your name and what community you're from.
Very well. Hello, my name is Ryan Schindler. First of all, I want to extend my greetings to the mayor. Mayor, I'm from the metropolitan area of Atlanta myself,
Hi.
so I'm glad to see you here.
Glad to be here.
This one is particularly directed to the two of you. I wanted to hear, just from your perspectives, an evaluation of the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you like about it? How would you like to see it involved? Is there anything that you are particularly critical about the movement as a whole? Anything that you would like to say in regards to that?
Us too. Oh, okay. Well, I think first of all, thank you for some of the things you just said. I think it's really important that we don't focus all of our attention on Black Lives Matter, because there's so many groups beyond Black Lives Matter, so many different generational groups. For me, what is crucially important from Black Lives Matter is the visibility, is the notion of calling attention from a younger generation to what they view as civil rights wrongs, areas that need to be addressed. For me, Black Lives Matter holds the hope of a younger generation being much more politically engaged. Because as you remember, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the argument was young folks aren't engaged. So for me, it's how do I take that engagement, and even in areas I don't agree, how do I take that engagement and use that to basically reinvigorate, candidly, an African American community sense of political engagement. I think Black Lives Matter really raises issues that many of us may not agree with, but I think the notion of condemning that is wrong, because I want to hear all their points of view. I think, for example, for me, building a national museum, let me tell you two things that really shaped it. One was going to Israel. Now, when I went to Israel, the goal was to make sure that we had at least a period to grapple with museums, because the Israeli museums do a better job than any museum community in the world of looking at national identity through a particular lens. And I wanted to say that the new African American Museum was about America's identity, not about a Black identity. And so Israel shaped that in profound ways. The other side, though, was that as we began to raise money for the museum, one of the groups that was not as active as I expected was the Jewish community. That in many ways, yes, we found new money from the Black community, money from the corporate community, but the Jewish community's support, now I'm generalizing, because there were wonderful exceptions. David Rubenstein gave $10 million, he's my best friend. But I think that generally, I would argue that we didn't get the support from that community that I had expected. And part of that could have been, there are a lot of reasons. But for me, the notion of recognizing that building this new relationship, whether it's been shaped by Black Lives Matter, touched by the Obama administration, I think the most important thing to realize is that for the first time, we need to develop a relationship of equals, because I'm not always sure in the past it was equals. And if you develop a relationship of equals, it means you're going to have to allow for debates and disagreements that we often find uncomfortable, but that are essential to the future of this relationship.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bowen, and I was anxious to attend this session because I think Black-Jewish relationships are often talked about as if the two are mutually exclusive. And I stand today to let you know that it is not always. I represent Congregation Temple Bethel in Philadelphia. We've been in existence for 65 years. We're a viable community. Can't hear? that is also a part of the Black Jewish community. Some of them have been in existence for over 100 years. For a while, I was a part of the Coalition, which was a think tank out in San Francisco under the late Dr. Gary Tobin. And he did some research, and at that time, maybe back in the early 2000s, he discovered that there were approximately 500,000 Black Jews in the country. I think his numbers are low. I think there are millions of us. I have never gone anywhere. We do very extensive travel. I've never gone anywhere where I haven't been able to find a community of Black Jews. We live quietly. Our purpose is to practice our faith, not to rock the boat. Although there are some, may I use the word, crazies, Black nationalists who would like to say that you are not the real people. But for the most of us, we are pro-Israel. My husband and I do a lot of speaking engagements, and at one of my last engagements, we were introduced as Black Zionists. I didn't realize that. But I think, especially in our community, we are comprised of 6 generations and young professionals who are extremely viable. We keep our mohel active. In fact, on Shavuot, our great-grandson was circumcised at his bris. But we are viable, and I think the greater Jewish community needs to recognize that we are here, that we do exist, and we are growing. In our area, many of the synagogues are either closing down or having to have joint services together because the people are just not attending shul and not supporting synagogues. The reverse is true for the Black community. Our communities are growing.
Thank you very much. It's very enlightening to hear about this, but
Okay.
we do need to move on. Unless you have a question you want to ask. Sure. Okay. Never mind. Thank you. I think we have a response too. We have a comment too. And maybe this also opens the issue of Jews of color, and for the lack of welcome, sometimes they feel. I mean, there's circumstances where that's not the case, but a lack of welcome they sometimes feel in the Jewish.
Just a quick question then. How can AJC and the Black Jewish community form viable coalitions moving forward?
Anybody want to respond to any of that?
I think organizations like the one that I went through that was in existence in Atlanta, the Black Jewish Committee, which is where I started when I was 26, 27, 28 years old, are more needed than ever. If you look at the group of individuals who went through the Black Jewish Coalition relationship, they're the people that have run and built modern Atlanta in a major way. And I think that because things got good in terms of the relationship, certainly in my city between our two communities, we've been neglecting the garden. And my argument is that this is definitely worth it, but because both communities are practical, it is also going to be increasingly needed. Because the problems that we have, if you just listen to this panel, are clearly knotty problems. But one of the best lessons that I have had from mentors of mine is that good things come from working at hard problems together. And relationships are built even when you agree to disagree. And what I see right now is there isn't a framework for that at all. And so when I started, I said throwing away old relationships and old frameworks, I think is one of the biggest mistakes that both of us have made. And we certainly need to establish those frameworks among generations of people who have not had the experience that others have had.
So if I could, I want to just add one sentence of it. First of all, thank you so much for what you said. Look, I think if we're going to be honest, I think that the American Jewish community, in its kind of leadership structure, has functioned for a long time as if the only Jews in America were white Ashkenazim, right? You will hear Sephardim in general, Jews of Arab, Hispanic, let's say Jews from Arab lands, say the very same things. You look at the list of the boards of major Jewish organizations, and Sephardim are basically, Mizrahi Jews are absent, right? And in some ways, it reminds me of, people debate who first said this, Jews are like everybody else, only more so. In some ways, the American Jewish community has played out some of the same disempowerment of its members, right? And to coin a term, the invisibilization, right? And I think that's true, right? To talk about black-Jewish relations as if it's a binary of two groups, whereas in fact, I think one of the revolutions of the last 20 years is more and more Jews, again, I think this tends to be true more about younger Jews than of older Jews, are aware that, wait, black-Jewish relations, you're talking about me, not, right? There are many black Jews who embody that very conversation. And we are only beginning to open up that conversation in the Jewish community, really at the very, very, very beginning. And so I think it's really important to put that on the table, and thank you.
I wonder if you can be.
And this, by the way, is Sherry Frank, formerly regional director in Atlanta, and I'm sure one of the creator of the Black Jewish Coalition.
We love you, Kasim.
I love you back.
Here, busting with pride. I wonder if you can be specific about 2 or 3 or 4 issues that we ought to put on the table. It was very easy, 30 or 40 years ago to deal with, redlining of banks or housing or, some of the earliest civil rights things. So can you be specific about them? And also, clearly, do you think the Jewish community is ready to jump on the bandwagon of the central issue in Black Lives Matter, which is this whole issue of criminal justice?
I think, candidly, we have been doing a lot of positive work on the criminal justice issue. When we were discussing Black Lives Matter, I agree with quite a number of things that folks from Black Lives Matter have put forward, which is why it's so important when you disagree, you need to be able to say that as well. In terms of concrete conversations, we need to have much deeper and thoughtful conversations on the Jewish-Palestine issue and the relationship, and it needs to be heard all of the way out, and there needs to be a forum where everybody can have their opinions heard, because versions and explanations that are unchallenged and incorrect are ravaging or running through both communities. And it is causing a gap to be created where I think hard work could really improve upon that gap. It may not be that you end up at the exact same place, but you don't have the level of ignorance that you have around the issue that I think exists today. I also think that around the law enforcement issue, which really spurred Black Lives Matter. I've had that conversation. Not only have I it, I have lived it. I'm 47 years old, and I remember when my daddy sent me to Howard University, said, son, keep both hands on the wheel. If an officer walks up, don't look him in the eye, look straight. Place your wallet in the seat next to you. Ask for permission to pick up your wallet. Don't challenge the officer because it's important for you to get home. I'm 47. So I think a real conversation that deepens the understanding around the total law enforcement issue, including the prison industrial complex, would probably be number 2. And then number 3, I really believe that there needs to be a revisiting of the kind of issues that led to the creation of the African American Museum. And we need to get back to facts. Because when I sit with a lot of young folks on both sides of the table, both the Jewish table and the African American table, they don't know very much. And I don't mean whether they can Google it. I mean no. And so I think a deepening of how both communities got to where they are really does need to take place. If those 3 things were happening in any forum, I think that the juice would be worth the squeeze.
Lonnie, do you want to talk for a moment about what the museum is doing to confront exactly what we've just heard about, the need to build knowledge about the Black-Jewish relationship and that?
Well, I think that, can I add one thing to the question you asked, though? I think that in some ways, we think we've dealt with the obvious manifestations, but so many of the civil rights issues are still the same issues. For me, one of the most important issues is educational access, right? That I'm of a generation that got through the window with support from a variety of communities. I look at the generations going through schools now, how few African Americans are in those schools. My youngest daughter graduated medical school 2 weeks ago, right? And my oldest daughter's a lawyer, so I'm Jewish. But the point that I want to make is that there were 75 students graduating medical school in her class, and there were 3 people of color. And to me, if this is 50 years after the civil rights movement, then we failed. And so I think educational access is crucially important. I think it's important quickly for the museum to recognize that it's a museum that's not about yesterday. It's about today and tomorrow. So one of the major things I'm doing is putting together a center that's looking at Black-Jewish relations, historically, contemporary, looking at how we basically, it's hard for me to say this in Washington, but basically my goal is to create something that helps us get better, that allows us to debate, that allows us to fight, but allows us to realize that we are so much better when we're pushing against America and asking it to be what it said it would be. And so I think that's one of the goals for me, is to make sure that this museum is as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday.
There we go. So I kind of wanted to follow up on what Deborah was speaking to, which is this false dichotomy between Jews and Black people, and the way in which this false dichotomy really erases Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. And with all of that in mind, to ask if you really think that we can improve non-Jewish, Black, and Jewish relations without cleaning up our side of the street. Like, we have a racism problem in the Jewish community. We have a disempowerment problem in the Jewish community. And why are we skipping all those steps and rushing outside of the community before we actually address what's going on in the community?
That's you. So here's my visceral, immediate response to that. I'm always hesitant about. You can't hear me anymore? Now you can? I'd have to hold my tie to my mouth. Do it? Like that? Or is this better? Yes. Okay, thank you. I'm a little hesitant about sort of a chronological approach for the simple reason that I think it's going to take a very long time. It's going to take at least a generation to make real progress on the question of the leadership of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews and of African American Jews in the Jewish community. I don't think it's advisable for the Jewish community, which has unprecedented access, wealth, and power in the history of Jews in diaspora, to wait until that is fixed before building relationships and becoming partners in other questions, fundamental questions of justice in America. To me, it seems that the approach that makes sense here is both. Meaning, to look inward without looking outward is to make the mistake of a different form of insularity. It's to expand the inside, but to leave the outside alone. And conversely, to only look outside without asking deep questions about the inside, which is, I think, in many ways, what we've done at moments in the past, arguably even in the present, is also a mistake because it kind of lacks a certain kind of, for lack of a better word, holism, right? You can't say we are leaders in the struggle for civil rights, but African American Jews are invisible. At some level, there's like a deep contradiction there that is existential and moral. So to me, it seems like we ought to do both. In order to do both, we have to be honest about both, and that's a hard sell. Like, I want to say it's funny, as I hear a lot. I've heard it from people who have sent me hate mail, but more importantly, I've heard it even from people who are friends. Not long ago, a couple years ago, I was sitting at a dining room table with somebody I know, not a close friend, who said, a white man, who said, at the end of the day, I just don't think that in contemporary America, racism holds anybody back. And so my response was, here's the thing. You can present that as an opinion. However, that is empirically demonstrably false. There is an ocean of social scientific literature that demonstrates the falsity of what you've just said, right? Let's take a very simple example, right? I think it's a study at the University of Chicago, but I may be misremembering that, right? Social scientists sent resumes, identical resumes for the same job. On some of the resumes, the first name was Tyrone, and in the other ones, it was something almost ridiculous, like Biff. It was something like unmistakably hundreds of generations of white people in America, right? And they came to the conclusion that a white first name was worth 10 years of work experience. That is shocking. Here's the thing, it's shocking to white people. It's not shocking. It's not shocking to black people. It's not shocking to the black Jews in this room. It's shocking to many of the white Jews in this room. And that's part of the problem, right? We have to actually know what we're talking about. I'm always reminded of, I think a lot about this, there's an amazing Hasidic story. I can't go a whole session without doing this, but there's a famous story about a great Polish Hasidic Rebbe named Simcha Bono of Pshisha who used to tell his students, for every mitzvah, for every obligation, there is the obligation, and then there's going one step beyond. So one of the students says, but Rebbe, you're not allowed to lie, right? What would be going beyond that? And he said, well, that would mean not lying to yourself. There's something really fundamental about that it's long past time that white people in America be willing to talk about.
Okay, we're going to take 3 questions as a group. Everyone take mental notes or written notes if you like, and then we'll finish up with a chance for everybody to have their last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have a grand thesis, but I have 2 observations that I think are pertinent to what has been said. First, as Jews, we can and should look back not just with nostalgia, but with pride on the times that when our rabbis and our synagogue elders went down to the South and marched in the civil rights movement and with Dr. King and so on. But I think it's relevant that what they did at that time was to go down somewhere else. The first major fissure in the black Jewish unity that I recall was Ocean Hill, Brownsville, when there were black parents and students on one side and Jewish teachers on the other. I'm making a comment. I don't have a question. Is that all right? Is that permissible? Yeah. The second thing is, all right, I'll ask it as a question. With respect to the observations that were made about occupation, I would ask you to comment on the fact that Palestinians have always been under occupation. I was just in Ramallah last month, and I wonder if you feel that the occupation, lamentable as it is, of Israel, of the West Bank, is harsher than the previous occupation by Jordan, or the previous occupation by Egypt of Gaza, or the previous occupation by Britain, or the previous occupation by Turkey. How would you rank those?
Okay, another couple. Okay. Okay.
I think everybody's awake.
Good morning. I'm Ann Oppenheimer from Chicago.
Hi, Ann.
My friends up there. A question that folds into each other. Could you work with the use of vocabulary? I just came back from an extensively long trip to Israel, which was wonderful, and the use of vocabulary came up a lot. And then into that, could you please, as someone who grew up in the civil rights movement and watching my parents, and here I am at AJC and pretty soon going to be 70, so I can't call myself the youth anymore. Could you help identify the leaders of some of these movements that could be brought together to help address the issues that we are sitting in this room discussing? So,
Excellent.
vocabulary and leadership.
Okay, and
please.
One last question to add to the group. You've got someone over there.
My name is Miriam Groß. I'm a German pastor in New York, and I'm an interfaith partner to the AJC in New York City. And I'm commencing my doctorate on the research of Hitler's roots within the Jim Crow era. And my question towards you, because I'm very concerned about a recurrence of what happened within Nazi Germany, is what will you as a panel and the Black Jewish community and relationship will do to stop a recurrence? Because what I'm seeing in my research is heavily burdening and it's very concerning. So this would be my question. What can you do against a recurrence of this event?
We have to go out. I know we're in a group of intellectuals, but we have to go out and beat people that have views that are inappropriate and unacceptable. I don't think that we could be at a more powerful moment when we understand the consequences of elections and who controls and what decisions individuals make and what leaders have the ability really to unleash. And there is a reason for courtesy, and there is a reason for the way you have conversations. But at the end of the day, we got to go and beat people. This is a struggle that is occurring, and I don't mean beat in any physical way. But we have to have the same kind of intensity about how we feel about America that other people on the other side are having. We have been through this kind of fever before, and we have been through this kind of struggle before. And I think that we got a little comfortable when the more noble feelings among us were winning out, and we got to a point where we thought that that was going to be a permanent state of being. And I think that we are shocked right now that really is not the case. So when you ask, what am I going to do? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get out and beat people that hold these views that are offensive to me and that don't represent a bigger, bolder vision of my community and of the broader community in America. And I think that, I say all of the time, we're engaged in a situation where folks want to win, we want to govern. And you've actually heard it. You've actually heard some folks saying, man, we didn't know what was going to happen once we got these kind of controls. And I think you can have that conversation in a bipartisan way. There are things that are going on in the American conversation that are inappropriate and that are leading to the diminution of American leadership and to the diminution of our overall success in the country. And the only way that you really push back against these things really is to get control of the levers of government, as uncomfortable as that might be to say.
As a historian, I tend to use the past to give me confidence about the present and the future, right? But I have to be honest, I'm really worried. I'm worried because if you question you raised, as you know, last week a noose was found in the museum. I wish I could tell you that's the first time something like that happened. I have been getting death threats for the last 12 years building a museum. The reality is that the level of security that I now have to have in my museum is frightening. And so for me, this is not about an intellectual exercise. This is about saying that this is a time in America where hatred is not just unleashed, but it's acceptable. And that I worry a great deal about divisions. The more we're divided, the easier it is for this hatred to bubble up and take over. And for me, coming together means, yes, we've got great differences. I'm not saying put them aside, but recognize that we've got to overcome those, or at least acknowledge those, because the greater good is at risk. And so I am very worried. And I guess the best way to say it is, when we found the noose, a member of my staff asked me to write something, so an op-ed came out. And as we were talking earlier, the amount of hatred that bounced back on a simple op-ed. As somebody said, and my young staff was very upset, the first responses was, well, we could solve the problem by destroying the museum. This is an America that I recognize, but I didn't expect to be in.
So, just on a very personal level, I think my first response is to say something that, I wrote the morning after the election to a group of students of mine, which is that all of us have an obligation to be very clear with ourselves about what our red lines are and what we're willing to do to defend them. And one of the things I often recommend to people is make sure that you have shared those red lines with people you respect enough that they can hold you accountable. Because it is always easier at the moment when it might cost something to stand up, to find a way to not do that. So really being clear about what your personal red lines are, I think is really fundamental. And that sometimes requires courage. I mean, one of the things I think it is hard, and this is true whether you regard yourself as on the far right of the political spectrum or the far left or the middle, right? To dissent politically from people that you otherwise have pleasant interactions with is quite hard, right? Courage does not mean fearlessness. Courage means not allowing your fear to have the final word. So, when I write something on CNN and then I have to look at the cesspool that's at the bottom of the page, right? The comment section, I'll be honest, it actually does frighten me. And it's a constant process for me to keep telling myself, okay, so it frightens me. But I feel obligated to do it. And again, you could disagree with me on this issue or that, but what's your issues that you have to speak up on and not allowing yourself to stand down? I want to share something about the Hebrew Bible for a minute, because it's actually really relevant to this discussion. So all over the ancient Near East, we learn that the kings of various societies are responsible for the welfare of widows and orphans, who are really kind of both concretely widows and orphans, and the stand-in for those who are vulnerable and exposed to the power of others. The Hebrew Bible has some of that. You have certain texts that talk about how the king of Israel is responsible for the widows and orphans. But in the Chumash, in the Pentateuch, something very dramatic happens, which is that all of a sudden it is no longer the king who is responsible for the fate of widows and orphans, but rather all of Israel, hence the insistence on the plural. That is what I call the democratization of moral responsibility in the Hebrew Bible. You can't say, well, I'm waiting for Mayor Reed to fight, right? Because I elected him to do my work. You have to yes, but also, what about us? What about each of us? What are we willing to stand up for? What are we willing to take risks for? Now, just one last thought, if I could, in response to something that was said earlier. I think one of the most unhealthy developments, and maybe it's always been true, but it's the internet, I think, elevates this a lot, is what I would call, some people have started to call the impulse to whataboutism, right? If you say that X is problematic, so someone says, well, what about that? Isn't that worse? To which the answer is often, yes, it is. But something being worse doesn't make the thing that you're talking about good. So, yes, Palestinians, sadly, have been used as a ping pong ball by a lot of people for a very long time. There are worse fates than living under the Israeli government, like, for example, living under the genocidal monster that is Hamas, right? However, that does not mean that the occupation is not a moral problem. And it strikes me as an evasion to always say, well, there are things that are worse. It's true, right? There are things that are worse. There are places where black people of black skin are suffering worse than in America. That does not mean that police brutality in America is not a very real issue. So I would be careful about that impulse, which I think is a deflection. We should know history, but we should also not allow it to deflect us from the moral imperatives of the present.
Thank you. I'm going to drastically cut back what were going to be my closing remarks to basically three. No, it's been a great panel, to basically 3 sentences. And again, on the theme of past, present, and the future. So I heard somebody use the phrase of looking back on pride. So we do, at AJC, we do look back on pride in our history, which actually goes back to long before the 1950s and 1960s. AJC was advocating civil rights laws in New York State a century ago when, as Dr. King said, few dared to speak out. So that's a moment, that's something we're proud. We're proud of what we do today in our advocacy for voting rights, in the work not only that's being done in Atlanta, but our Washington Regional Office, which brings together young people through a young leadership group at the National Urban League, who meet on a regular basis with our young leadership group here in Washington. And they, not too long ago, had a couple of weeks where they went first to the Holocaust Museum and then to the museum that Lonnie heads, and are going to have a debriefing together to talk about what they've learned. So these are important things that we can well take pride in. But the themes we've heard today is, as we all know, everything changes, and what the issues we faced then, even the issues we face today, are going to change and evolve. And what's needed is encounter, dialogue, relationship, coming to each side, we have our obligation on the Jewish side. We're looking for counterparts to understand as well what our concerns are, and to move forward on a basis that looks at the present honestly and thinks about today's issues instead of looking back through the gauze at the past. And among those partnerships, I'm thrilled to hear about the center that you're developing at the museum. I'm looking forward to our being partners with you specifically on that as it goes forward. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for a fantastic discussion.
Thank you.